Hallo und herzlich willkommen bei Kaiser TV. 2 Monate ist es jetzt her, mehr als 2 Monate, dass Donald Trump Präsident geworden ist. Und heute sprechen wir über seine Präsidentschaft, über Donald Trump und über seine Politik. Und ich habe die große Ehre, hier bei mir zwei, naja, kann man sagen, Amerikaner, Menschen mit Verbindung zu den USA zu haben und aus einer etwas besondereren Perspektive heute zu sprechen, nämlich da gibt es starke familiäre Verbindungen zu den USA und die beiden werden das heute aus ihrer eigenen Perspektive einmal betrachten. Und das Schöne ist natürlich auch, wir haben heute eine recht kontroverse Positionierung heute hier mit zwei ganz unterschiedlichen Menschen mit unterschiedlichen Sichtweisen darauf. Und bei mir sind heute Courtney, gebürtig aus Amerika. Schön, dass du da bist, Courtney. Und Bernie, auch bekannt von ANKA Medien. Bernie, Student hier in Köln der Sozialwissenschaften und ihr kennt ihn vielleicht schon von einigen Livestreams bei uns auf Kaiser TV. Schön, dass ihr da seid und ich würde sagen, es geht los. So we are 2 months into the presidency now. It's been, like 70 days since the inauguration of Donald Trump as president. What are your personal experiences so far, maybe from the American view as to your family or friends in America? Do you have some?
Actually, it's just been a complete shitstorm so far. In my opinion, the entire, even before he got inaugurated, I had the feeling that maybe, after the election, everyone would just calm down and just be a bit more civilized, maybe just chill out a bit, and start talking to each other normally again. But I just got the feeling that everyone's still screaming at each other, there's still a war going on. It's like, I actually told this to a friend of mine recently. It's like there's some points I would like to criticize Trump on quite openly, but it's just that I get the feeling I'm still kind of in the trenches of the election, and every time I want to say something, okay, Trump does something bad here, everyone on the other side says, oh yeah, you said he's terrible, now impeach him or something. It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. And it's just, the fire keeps one in the trenches. But maybe that's a very weird way of expressing it, but that's kind of the feeling I got. It's still quite uncivilized, let's put it that way. It's still quite savage, and you do actually kind of feel somewhat, I don't want to overdo it because still I'm just a guy on the internet, as I said, but it feels like you're kind of at war with like the old media and what I would consider myself part of the newer media, online media maybe. And there seems to be a very clear divide between one corporate media hating Trump and then other freer or individual people supporting him online. So yeah, all I've experienced so far was there's basically a bunch of lies flying around. I have some relatives that believe them, I have some that don't, and even among those there's a rift basically appearing, because actually I think one of the fundamental problems, and I've said this in the past too, is that I think the perceptions of reality, what is real and what's not, what's a lie and what's not, are drifting apart so far by now that people actually live in different worlds at this point. And the whole fake news thing ties into that, because what some people would officially call fake news, the government would call fake news, I would probably call the truth, and vice versa. And so I get the feeling that one of the problems connecting with people, even with my own relatives, I have discussions with my mother a lot because she was a Hillary supporter, although she's German, so she didn't get to vote, but since I think the 90s even. And I constantly have discussions with her, and it's quite hard because we operate of different assumptions, different information basically, and it's sometimes hard to even that out, even with my own relatives.
Yeah, I mean, I have a completely different perspective and different experience. I have a very large family, more than 120 people. And I've lived in Germany for so long that I've lost most of my contact with them, so that when we do see each other, politics are generally off the table as a discussion. That doesn't mean that I don't know what their political beliefs are, but I don't see this in real life being much of a debate. I see a lot of worry a lot of fear about the possibilities for their future. I come from a very poor family, and his policies will impact them tremendously. And in that respect, then I think there's a lot of respect for each other between, people who voted for him and people who didn't vote for him. That everybody feels like they're in this boat where the water is rocking the boat. They don't know if they're going to come out of it. And so in that respect, I think I have a different experience than you do. And I think it does help that I live in Germany and not in the US, because I don't take these issues then as personally. I do feel personally affronted by some of the politics that he voices. I also, however, feel that the fire that you discuss as being there has been something in American politics for so long, based on the two-party system. People believe you're either this or you're that. And you can trace that back even to George W. Bush. You're with us, you're against us. And that just incites hatred. I don't think that what's going on right now is really anything new in that respect. Okay. I think maybe it just got a lot stronger and a lot more feeling. People who voted for Trump feel like they were the outsiders. People who didn't vote for him now feel like they're the outsiders. And when you have that feeling, we see that with jihadis, for example, that's what makes them explode. And that's, I think, a really dangerous position to be in. But at least in terms of my family, I think, I don't have such an incendiary discussions. Okay. Yeah.
So you were talking about worries. From your point of view, what would you regard as the most urgent issues an American president has to tackle right now?
An American president or this American president?
Maybe just generally, what are the most important issues right now, regardless of president?
Yeah.
I think it's really difficult to be, talking about this just, a few days after the healthcare system repeal fell through. I think that a really big concern among people in the US and also in Germany, this is not an unusual concern, is for their stability. And that's not only, they express it in terms of like security against terrorism, but financial stability is a huge issue. And the cost of living in the US is astronomical. People do have jobs, but they don't have jobs that pay for that cost of living. And I think that healthcare is one of those things that contributes to that tremendously. I think that whatever you have to say about Obamacare, I think that, it's great that it didn't get repealed. I think there needs to be enormous reform done in the healthcare and health insurance system. There's no reason why I would have a baby in a hospital fully insured and pay $20,000 anyway. It makes living impossible. It makes these things that we take for granted under Germany's social system impossible.
Though I'm not even sure if Obamacare made that any better. For instance, just as an anecdote, my grandmother under Obamacare now has to pay double or triple the healthcare insurance that she had to do before. And she's 80 years old. She now needs pregnancy insurance. And my grandfather had a vasectomy 20 years ago. And it's kind of stuff like that. And they live sort of in the Rust Belt, like on the Indiana state border. And I feel that among my relatives, most of their healthcare costs, as far as I've heard, have actually gone up substantially under Obamacare, and apparently it doesn't really address the issue of it costing too much. Yes, it costs way too much, and I think that has been a problem for a while now, hasn't it? What actually shocked me to find out was, and of course correct me if I'm wrong on anything, because you might have more insight on these things, what shocked me to find out was that interstate competition wasn't actually allowed. And that was like one of the biggest criticisms Trump also had during the campaign. It was something that libertarians, whom I consider myself a part of, have had a lot of issues with. And I just thinking about it, it's like the Techniker-Krankenkasse here in Germany just having a monopoly in Schleswig-Holstein but not being allowed to compete anywhere else. If you just think of it in that terms, you kind of see why the costs would go up so drastically if you basically have like 50 localized monopolies or something like that. And I think another problem was the whole system, how it works, where the deductibles are very high, where people basically have to pay half of the bill anyway, or a substantial part of the bill, but they don't actually get to see what their insurer pays. So the doctor just writes up a randomly large amount, as much as they can basically pay on their own, and then just, if that's 20%, then he puts that times 4 and charges the insurer that. I think just the whole way the whole system was designed is so broken that the cost would just rise naturally just by people abusing the system, by doctors basically saying, well, he's not going to protest because he's not going to see the actual bill in the end. I'm not sure if Obamacare actually cut deeply enough there or actually did much of anything, to be honest. And in the end, it now seems to have just raised the prices for other people without addressing the core issues that the American healthcare system had in the first place. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we can debate the necessity of this particular program. I definitely think that there are issues with it. It's something that I've known since the first time I went to the hospital, how expensive it can be and how it can completely bankrupt a family, bankrupted mine more times over. Healthcare costs are absurdly high, they're unaffordable, and by having a health insurance system that requires that you have an employer, you have issues. Obamacare was supposed to take care of that, and in fact it did. Some people who weren't working or who were working freelance were able to be insured, which was impossible up until that date. That doesn't mean that this plan that he has is perfect, and I know that when they debated it, 10 years ago, even before that, there was discussions of tort reform, which means malpractice lawsuits. All those discussions occurred, but in the end, you have pharmaceutical lobbies, you have these medical facilities. They earn a lot of money, and they can only earn that if there isn't reform done to medical costs. And I think in that regard, the American president has to take on this late capitalism, overcharging everybody for things that we should consider, in my opinion, a necessity and not a luxury. Having a child should not be a luxury. And when I, as a fully insured person, have to pay $20,000 out of pocket to go to a hospital and deliver a baby, that is a luxury. That means that every person who has a child then not only has to think about what are the consequences of having this child in terms of child care, what the college, university fees are going to be. They have to think about, how am I going to walk out of the hospital? And that, we've all heard these stories for years, $8 for an aspirin when you're in the hospital, and, an ambulance ride that costs, $1,000, even though it's just 2 streets away. I think that needs to be something that's addressed. But I also am not sure that it's really within the American mentality to be interested in supporting other people in that way. Like, why wouldn't your grandmother want to be paying maternity insurance, or you as a man paying maternity insurance for another person to have a child? Why? Life is something that happens. It's like, I don't want to pay for your vasectomy, but I still have to, in the end. There's some sort of give and take, and what you feel like as a human being. I don't mind paying a little bit extra for you to not fall down, right?
It's an interesting point, because we agree on the fact that healthcare is way too expensive and it should cost far less. But I think we're not quite in sync about the causes of that, because when you said it's not maybe in the American mentality to help other people, I would basically ask, well, why would it be necessary? And then you could say, okay, it's very high cost, but why is it very high cost? And if we go back to the causes of the high cost, for instance, for student loans or for healthcare, most of that is government interfering in the free market. It's not, you said late capitalism, that's basically where I would take issue now, is I don't think it's actually capitalism. It's basically, it's a corporatist system, I guess I would call it, where the big corporations and the government work together to stifle competition or to create monopolies. And basically, it also ties into the campaign finance reform and stuff like that, because big corporate interests, multinational corporations, have too much power in American politics, and they use that power to affect changes in the law that benefit them and not normal Americans, I would dare say. And that's something we saw in Obamacare, but that's something we saw in very many other regions. In Obamacare, I think specifically was the pharmaceutical companies that got their part in there. And in the end, the bill was so big that nobody really knew what was in it, but everyone kind of knew what was in it concerning them. And I guess in the end, I know this phrase is hated by many people, but deregulation in this case, just keeping government out of it so that people won't have as much of an interest in actually giving the money to get what they want. If government doesn't have the power to screw everyone over, or change everyone's life the way they see fit, then it's not really worth it paying them anything, I guess. Currently, the return on investment on lobbyism is above 200% on almost any area, and in many areas it's even higher than that. And if you have a return on investment that high on something, then basically I wouldn't as much fault the corporation, although they're certainly a cause of it, for taking that, because if they didn't, they would basically be violating the best interest of their own constituents, because the other corporations would take that return on investment, would do that lobbying, and they would shut them out. And if you don't take it, you basically get shut out of the system. So my idea would have basically been just get the government to stop its overreach, get it out of most of these things, allow interstate competition, maybe pull back a bit of the regulation on medicine prices, and then the whole healthcare system will be way, way cheaper. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but in the early around 1900 it was, I think, there was another healthcare crisis in the US where doctors basically complained that healthcare was too cheap and they couldn't make enough money off it. And then they had a bunch of regulations installed where they had to have a doctor's license, which wasn't apparently a requisite before that, where you had to have, where midwives weren't really allowed to do whatever they did before and stuff like that, and just got increasingly more expensive with time, with more government interference. So I'm not sure if I would agree with the late capitalism part. I definitely agree with the assessment of the problem, but maybe not with the cause of it.
I mean, I don't think that we take issue with each other's. I think that we both agree that healthcare is too expensive, and we both agree that part of that is because there's a corporate lobby that has increased the prices. The solution that you proposed is not the solution I would propose, but I think we both can agree that there's a problem with medical costs. Yeah.
So, okay, I'll ask you the same question as I did, as I posed Courtney. What do you think are the most urgent issues now?
Well, basically, there's very many issues that individually are quite important, but I think the most basic issue is in the cause of what I would see the cause of most of the problem is government overreach in almost every aspect of an American's life. If you look at the NSA stuff, where basically we know that every American gets spied on constantly, gets all their communications monitored, that is not constitutional. That should not be allowed. When we look at certainly other stuff the CIA is doing, who have been destroying governments in the Middle East and elsewhere for generations now, that should not be allowed, because I don't think it's in the best American interest to get rid of Assad or get rid of Gaddafi or whatever and just basically destabilize the whole point. I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of people died in Syria now because of what the Americans did there? How many millions even died in Iraq because of what the Americans did there? And it's not even, and I said before, I'm a libertarian. I blame both parties equally. I mean, the worst president we had in recent history was, in my opinion, George Bush, by far, because he was a war criminal. That's another form of government overreach, the military-industrial complex, where you basically just have the Americans intervening in places like the Middle East and having hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people die there for no real good reason. And what makes it even sadder, but what makes it even sadder is I went to Iran with a teacher of mine who was a professor for Iranistic before becoming my teacher, I guess. It was a bit of a downgrade, but whatever. And we went there after school. It wasn't with the school anymore, but after we were done with Abitur, we went to Iran, had a little trip there, and I actually learned there that they had a democratically elected government for a few years in the 60s under Mossadegh, who was kind of a weirdo apparently, but he was democratically elected, let's put it that way. And then the CIA, with the help of the British, basically overthrew him, reinstalled the Shah. The Shah killed a bunch of people, and then incited a revolution there against him, which was a combination of basically socialists, Democrats, communists, and Islamofascists. I think in Iran it was basically the CIA destroyed a functioning democracy, and the end result of that is now an Islamofascist state of a sort. It's a nice place. I love the Iranian people. They're great people. But the state itself is very oppressive, and you can actually see that in day-to-day life. They have their moral police in the streets telling women, oh, put on your headscarf if you don't do that. And most women they put it back very far, basically pin it to the back of their hair or something, just as an act of rebellion. And sometimes they just actually get put in prison for that for a day or two. And that's not a good thing at the end of the day. So government overreach in almost every aspect, and that's the most important thing, I guess, right now, is, in my opinion, the biggest problem the US has in the moment, and it's making it everyone else's problem too, and that's another big part of it.
So, Bernie, then where does your hope stem from that Donald will change this government overreach and big government?
Well, I think, yes, it's pretty much a hope in most cases, because I see that most people that I do not like for their government overreach really do not like Donald Trump. For instance, the CIA really doesn't like Donald Trump. And if the CIA doesn't like someone, I'm like, hey, that guy's probably all right. If Dick Cheney comes out like, oh, that guy is terrible, it's like, all right, I like him even more now. If George Bush and all the corrupt politicians that led us to this place say this guy is a terrible person, he's either a really terrible person or he's actually quite good. Now, from what he's said or how he's acted so far, brutish as it may be at times, I've pretty much gotten the impression that he's somewhat of a New York Republican, somewhere in the middle. He's more Democrat than Republican, really, in some points. Pretty liberal type of guy. Who's been, even since the 80s, and that's the thing that I don't know if it was going to come up, but I'm just going to say it here. Even since the 80s, he said, I don't care if gay people get married or not, let them marry, basically. And Obama and Clinton, all the others, into the 2000s said, no, marriage is between a man and a woman. And it's just remarkable on some issues how consistent he has been over all these years. And then there's other issues where I'm not entirely sure where he stands and where it's a good amount of guesswork in the end. And I think it's actually, of course, somewhat trust in him, because I trust the people that basically talk positively about him more than I trust him himself. And because he has done some things that already have gone against government overreach. For instance, when he cancelled the TPP, for instance, when he had cancelled the TTIP, two things that on the left and the right had been very controversial that actually both sides didn't really like very much. And he stopped those, and I think Hillary Clinton would have just let them through like that, because she had been a big supporter of the whole thing. And unlike Hillary Clinton, that's why I said it needs context, unlike Hillary Clinton, he didn't get donations from pretty much every foreign state or from every big corporation out there. And the problem with that is that most people, and you may not agree with this, but most people who voted Trump, I think, had at least half of their reason that they're Team ABC, anyone but Clinton. It's not even Hillary herself, it's Bill too. Both of them are corrupt as hell, and the Bushes were, and everyone else's, and it's not the level of corruption I can actually see with Donald Trump. I don't see him as corrupt, and most of the things that are talked about him that are negative are lies or slander, and provably lies or slander. And that's one of the reasons I think I actually have some hope in him, is because what he says his ideas are, what he wants to do is sometimes good, sometimes It's like 50-50 basically, or other proportions is, of course, random numbers. But everyone else who has shown in their actions that they are corrupt people, the corporate media, the big corporations themselves, the corrupt politicians like McCain or Cheney or Clinton, they have basically they lie about him, they slander him. So I'm like, okay, if they see him as a threat, he can't be that corrupt. And that's pretty much where the hope comes from. It's one of these, well, everyone I hate hates him, so yeah, it's pretty much...
So you would rather say, I assume you would say that's 100% horrible what he says, what Donald Trump says.
What Donald Trump says? I don't actually pay attention to what he says. I have a hard time watching him speak.
His policies or his...
I think one of the major issues with this election, and I don't want to rehash it, but one of them was that he never had an agenda, to the point that people could say, these are the things that he's going to look at, and this is the action that he's going to take. He did, in his speeches, say things like, I'm going to build a wall, but he'd never actually written that down, and I think it's hard then to be an issues voter if you don't have, the ability to compare the two issues. You have the ability to say, I don't like Hillary, but you don't necessarily have the ability to say, I do like him, and I think that it is one of the issues with him that people have said is, in many respects, he follows exactly what he wants to say, like he is getting plans for a wall, but at the same time, he will often say, oh, I never said that, and they have it on video that he has said that. I think that, I don't think that at this stage it's helpful to say that Hillary would have been a better or worse president. I don't think that that's the case at all, and it never really was for me. For me, it was really very much, why do politicians not acknowledge what the issues are and then respond to them? I feel like immigration was an issue that we saw with Brexit. It's an issue that we saw in Germany. We have seen it in the US. That's not, I would say, something that I felt like was pressing for my family. And my family could only speak about it from what they had watched on television. I think that that's a real issue in the US, how much people have domestic issues that need to be confronted. Like where I'm from, where my parents live, they have a meth epidemic where children are being taken out of homes because they're being born addicted to meth, and they don't even have a place to go. Their foster facilities are full. Where are the programs addressing that? Scott Walker is the governor of Wisconsin. He's a libertarian, and he decided, I'm not going to take care of this anymore, and this state has collapsed basically under his ideas, and that is really frustrating to have somebody like Donald Trump come in and say, well, look, everything is going bad. I'm going to save you by building a wall in Mexico. No, wait, save me by taking care of these kids who don't, who come to school without shoes on, who can't afford to eat lunch. Like, let's take care of these real pressing issues, not round up imaginary criminals. And that is where I sort of like have this issue where it feels like there's a really big disconnect between what, maybe what his policies are that he is so sort of promoting and what people on the ground are experiencing. I mean, I think that there is, also this, going back to what I said earlier, financial stability is a real issue. And he does a good job of talking a good talk. He says, I'm going to bring your jobs back to America by making Mexico pay for a wall. There's the logic of that discussion doesn't work. You can tell me that you're going to help me have a job. Show me how it's going to work. Show me how you're going to win jobs by building a wall in Mexico. That's what I don't see from him. And, to be honest, I don't know that I would have seen that from Clinton either, but I don't trust this man and his policies. Yeah.
Okay, well, speaking of illegal immigration, and you mentioned the wall, do you think that it's a scapegoat or a populist myth?
To be honest, I don't know what to make of it. I've never been to Texas. I don't go to the Southwest. I think there has been for many years rampant xenophobia and racism in the US. And if the wall has something to do with that, it's questionable. I've worked with people of all races and from all backgrounds my whole life. I'm an immigrant myself. I can't hate immigrants. I have no idea what to think about that wall.
But you're not an illegal immigrant.
What's illegal? I'm a privileged immigrant. They've said that to me when I go to get my visa. You're from a rich country. There are different rules for you.
Okay, what would you say? Is it bogus or is it a real concern?
I think it's a very real concern all across the Western world. Now, like you, I have not been to Texas myself. I've been, I think, most states east of the Mississippi, never west of it. So I did not see this in person, but what I hear is this, again, it's mostly statistics or reporting from people I trust. And I guess in the end, if they would lie to me, I don't think they do. Most of their data actually comes from places like the, crime statistics, the official government crime statistics, and stuff like that. And when you look at it, you get a picture where, for instance, one of the statistics from Amnesty International, this one, that of the women who cross the border illegally, I think 60% are raped on the way. Other shelters, women's shelters on the border, put it at 80%. And what I think, and I don't know about meth, but I've heard out of Vermont that they have a very big cocaine epidemic, I think it is there. Also a big drug epidemic. And the drugs, at least in Vermont, are coming across the Mexican border. And the problem there in my eyes is that, cocaine from Colombia.
Mexico to Vermont.
Yes. Yeah, it comes from the south. The cocaine is not produced in the US. It's produced in the Central and South American states. And the problem primarily isn't immigration per se. It's actually the cartels that control the parts of the border, who also get in touch with those who want to illegally immigrate, who want to illegally enter the US, to where the first thing people come in contact with when they go to the US, when they come from Central America, is actually organized criminals. Not the US government, not the Mexican government. They come into contact with organized criminals. And so if they come to the US and they live in not very nice areas, or they do not really have any chances for a good job, because maybe they don't speak the language, maybe they don't have the education for it, or maybe there's just no jobs around, they will have an easy contact to those organized criminals and help them out with their activities, or in the case of the women, just be raped on the way. And I think those are primarily issues. What Trump has said during the campaign is that he will build a wall and then he'll put a door in it, and if you want to come in legally, sure, go ahead. But I think it's also, in that case, it's not very nice to the actual legal immigrants, and there's a lot of those, from Latin and South America, who went through the whole process for years and years and years, and went through all this hardship to get a US citizenship if everyone else can just walk in if they want to. And that is my personal primary concern about this. It's actually about the well-being of the people themselves. Plus, then you get into arguments where, if you want to talk about economics maybe, where, of course, inner-city black people are harmed a lot if there's a bunch of cheap labor immigrating from the south, and they lose their job opportunities to Mexican or other immigrants from there. I don't know, I wouldn't call that xenophobia in any way. It's just actually, it's not in the best interest of any of the involved people.
But it's not based in fact. I mean, when I work as a waitress in Chicago and I have a busboy who's an illegal from Mexico making $5 an hour, that's taken away from some kid from the projects? How? I don't see how this is something that's based in experience. I think that there are real issues that have to be confronted in the U.S. I think that the problem of segregation in the U.S. is rampant. I think that discrimination against people of all races is rampant. I think that people's wages are not meshing with what it would take to live, a decent life. I think all of those issues are rampant, but I don't think that spending 60 billion euros or dollars, or whatever it is, to build a wall is going to address those issues. And I think that what we've seen from an environmental perspective, the UNDP had put out some statistics about 10 years ago, where they predicted this refugee surge, and it was predicted and predicated on a bit of climate change, which Mr. Trump doesn't believe in, but that people were going to start to see the inequalities that existed. They're going to want to come north because they understand that their experiences in the South are not ideal. They understand and see the U.S. as, and Europe as well, as a place in which you can earn a lot of money and have a nice life. I don't see how building a wall is in any way going to address those issues of inequality. I think you need to address the things that are causing that inequality, which are, for example, the U.S.'s need for cheap products, where they have then Hanes t-shirts being made in Honduras for 50 cents a piece, maybe work on that trade pact to make sure that, Hanes isn't outsourcing to the Honduras, that kind of stuff. I can totally imagine, being in line with, some of your ideas about deregulation. I simply cannot believe that this wall is in any way going to address any of the issues that exist within the U.S. I don't see it happening. I don't see how keeping people out of a country is going to resolve anything. And it's been shut down by not the Supreme Court, but by the appeals courts. Yeah, there's a Muslim ban. There's, if you're consistently also saying, I'm going to keep Muslims out, how can you not believe that that's xenophobia? He's called black people the N-word since the 70s. How do you not believe that he's a racist man?
When? I actually didn't see that anywhere so far. I didn't even see that. Sorry.
They have hearings of him in court for this discriminatory practices that he and his father used for hiring people, or not hiring, for allowing people to live in their buildings. I don't think that there's anything necessarily that speaks against this as being a xenophobia, a policy based in xenophobia and racism. I do think that these are issues that need to be addressed in the U.S. And I think that it's not just Trump. It's everybody needs to talk about them. I think that this has been an issue. I come from Milwaukee, which is one of the most segregated places in the country, and it has been since the 50s when they had a socialist mayor. It's an issue. People there are poor. Nobody's addressing it. Let's address those issues, though. Let's not just put up a wall that costs billions of dollars. That doesn't seem to be a realistic solution in my mind.
Maybe by bringing back jobs. So let's talk about the policy by Trump to prevent American corporations to outsource.
Actually, it's kind of interesting because in what you just said, there's, incredibly many layers of problems, yes. And of course, the basic premise, how does Mexican immigrating to Texas or something harm someone in a project in Baltimore, for instance? That is a good question. That itself would probably not do that. But then when you've got a larger labor pool, so just from an economic perspective, if you've got a larger amount of laborers, they will push down basically each other's wages, because you can always say, all right, I'm going to move my factory from, New York to the southern United States, which is happening constantly because wages there are lower because there's more of a labor force there, which is the same reason actually that, for instance, the Chinese are moving their factories from China to Africa in part because by this point they have lower labor costs in Africa. Or you said Honduras, or people producing their goods down there. So in that sense, there's one way that immigration could not damage, but lower the wages for other people within a country. It's something that during Brexit, of course, has been talked about with Polish immigration pushing down the wages for low-skilled labor in the UK, and which is a problem pretty much around the world. And that's actually, interestingly, in a pretty big power imbalance between low-skilled labor or laborers themselves and the multinational corporations who can just cannot just basically pick up, but they can say, well, we can close our factory here and produce somewhere else and we can still make the same amount of money or more. and we don't really care whether or not you keep your job because it doesn't affect us as much whether you're wealthy or poor, middle class. And in that respect, on the one hand, of course, the trying to renegotiate or whatever he wants to do NAFTA and not getting trade deals like the TPP and others into effect where the power of those corporations would have been raised even more significantly and made it more lopsided. That's one step, that's a good step, might keep some jobs in the US or might bring some back, some factories maybe back for low-skilled labor in the US. And on the other hand, then saying, well, we have a very large base of labor here that is unemployed or menially employed or really not employed at all, as you say. Why don't we just find jobs for our people first, and then we can have people coming in from the outside? In Germany, it's an economic argument. We need more immigration to keep our labor force the same. In the US as well, we have a bunch of people who are not in the workforce or who are unemployed, or who have to work 3 jobs. Why don't we just make it that they can live off 1 job before we let more people in, and just basically make the power that employers have even greater, because they can say, well, there's a dozen other people out there, we can just fire you and get the other guy in.
And what are your views on tariffs and protectionism? Like I said, preventing corporations to outsource their plans. Do you think it will help the economy?
I'm not a business person. I don't really think about those subjects, but I do think of it from a personal perspective in the sense of we live in a consumer society. Corporations make money on making things as cheaply as possible and selling as much as possible. And when you have a group of people who are complaining that their wages are too low to live, but they're unwilling to spend money on the product that they want to buy, then you have sort of like an imbalance, we'll say. You have, for example, American Apparel, which was based on the premise that they were going to hire local workers to create t-shirts and leggings and everything for a fair wage. But when you went to American Apparel, those products cost probably twice as much as what you would buy at H&M or Hanes. Do you buy at American Apparel because you believe that Made in America is better? That was something that I was raised with in the 80s, because everybody in my family was a factory worker. Everybody I knew worked full-time, steel mills. You bought things that were made in America because you were supporting the rest of the family. But then at some point, that stuff got outsourced, and then we could buy it cheaper. And people got into this consumption cycle. I want more things, and I'm not willing to pay or pay more. I can't work more. So then why not buy these things that were made in Mexico? It was the 80s that everybody said, we want things made in America, and then that went away. And I think that, a big part of that question comes with, okay, American wages have had to increase because our cost of living has had to increase, and our cost of living has had to increase because, for example, we don't get university education for free like in Germany. We don't have healthcare. We don't have subsidized daycare. That means in order to just have a normal life, you have to be making at least $20 to $30 an hour just to have a normal, average, I have insurance life. That's not like having a beautiful house. It's not living in New York City. All those places are much more expensive. And so of course you have this issue of people feeling like, well, I don't have enough money to afford these other things. And the companies sort of work with that. Yeah, we'll make those things cheaper for you, and then you can have them. And there's all this advertising, keeping up with the Joneses. I've got to have the best and the latest and the newest. I think that, from a business perspective, I can't talk to outsourcing. I can't talk to tariffs and so on, free trade agreements. I think that there's a substantial problem, however, in the US with people having a hard time with consumption, with advertising that's trying to promote consumption, and them not being able to live off of a wage that they've been offered. I don't know anybody in the US who can afford to work less than full-time. And as I was a kid, my dad worked 2 full-time jobs, 80 hours a week, to afford a house with kids. And not a crazy house, a house, and have kids. And that's insane to me. He could not pay for my university education. He did not pay for any of us to go to university. And I went to university 20 years ago when it was 1/5 the price of what it is now. There's no way that this is a sustainable thing. And I don't think that bringing jobs back to America is necessarily going to address the issues at hand, which are stuff costs too much. It's not feasible.
Yeah. Interestingly, this is a bit of a tangent, so I'll keep it short. And it's not really actually trying to make a point, it's just an observation. I had to write an essay a while ago about I wanted to write about the Great Depression, and I basically looked into back then prices of cost of living and stuff like that. And I was absolutely fascinated that in the, I think, 50s or something, people were able to afford a big house, 3-4 children, off one full-time employment, or one, maybe even less than full-time employment. For not even that big, it's like a guy working, I read a story about a guy working in a car mechanic, like a head car mechanic or something, and he could afford actually a quite big house and his 3 or 4 children, and his wife didn't work. And I was just very astonished at how that would actually work today, because I couldn't imagine that either, that today both parents have to work 3 jobs just to get over, the cost of living. And yeah. And I think, again, at that point you might want to look, or I would be interested in the root cause of basically what's causing that. And one of the arguments that I've heard that, of course, as a libertarian I would find better, or which brought me to libertarianism, is that, again, some people put this back to government overreach. For instance, the university thing, where if I were in the US, I wouldn't be studying. That's for sure. I couldn't afford it at all. And my parents make good money, but they couldn't afford university education in the US for me, and I wouldn't try to go into $50,000 debt or more for something that might not even be worth that much comparatively to not working, or to working for 5 years and 5 years of job experience. And for instance, I think student loans are guaranteed by the government, and so people for a long time didn't have to think about how can I afford to study, because they just got the loan from the government. Then the university said, well, they're not really, or they didn't literally say this, but I think the thought process went, well, they don't really pay attention to how much they pay because the government gives them a loan for it, so we can raise the prices. And that's, I think, where you start to see all the price increases for student loans.
So obviously, a movement which played a big role in helping elect Donald Trump as president was the alt-right movement. How do you see this movement? Is it a movement which tries to... Du hast es so schön gesagt. Which tries to...
Exercise free speech.
Ja, genau.
I guess in the start... Okay, the first thing I want to say, I actually usually say that when I talk to Germans about Trump, because it's... because of the way people are informed here, I think we have different views, obviously. Whomever is right, I dare not say, but we have different views on what Trump basically stands for. And what it basically says, okay, if I was actually of the opinion, if I actually did think that he was sexist, racist, and the bad things said about him, I would not have voted for him. So I would not have voted for him if I was of that opinion.
So you don't think that,
no, I do not think
that he's sexist or racist? Okay.
I do not think that he's sexist or racist, because I would not stand for that. I don't like those things, but... And that should... That's...
How is... He was caught on tape assaulting women. How is that not sexist?
No, he was not caught on tape assaulting women. That did not happen. He was caught on tape at one point saying that grab him by the pussy thing, which was incredibly stupid to say and incredibly
misogynistic, and it devalues a woman. There are 18 women who filed sexual assault claims against him.
And none of them had anything proven, and that basically, again, compare that to someone like Bill Clinton, who actually did provably rape people in the White House. I'm not
comparing it to Bill Clinton. I'm saying you're saying this man is not sexist, and I am saying that our definitions of sexism then are completely different.
It was never proven, or there weren't even any...
You don't need to prove to a woman that she has been raped for her to say that she has been raped.
There are no legitimate claims that were not politically motivated.
You cannot delegitimize a woman's claims on assault. If a woman says that she has been assaulted, you have to take that at face value. I am sorry. There's nothing okay about that.
What if the woman falsely accuses the man of rape?
This is 0.2% of cases have a woman falsely accusing a... No, it's not. Are you watching men's rights activists? This is actually a point where, you know, you can cut this, but this is actually my limit. I will not tolerate somebody saying that women do not get raped when they say they have been raped. And this is, seriously, I'm at my boundary.
Okay. I just ask for proof for things, but...
You don't need fucking proof to prove that a woman has been raped. You don't.
We disagree on that. Rape is the most heinous crime imaginable. It is. And I don't think we have to discuss that. It is the most heinous crime that can happen. It's probably worse than murder. From a moral perspective.
But you think that women who have said that this man has assaulted them should not be believed because some website that you looked at said that they couldn't prove it? I think that is...
I've seen a number of cases where women have falsely accused men of raping them, and that has completely destroyed the man's life.
Imagine being a woman who is willing to have her life destroyed by going public and saying, the women who have gone public against him have gotten death threats, have gotten rape threats. Do you know what I get as a woman who deals with the subject of rape in her writing? What do I get from emails from men just like you? Oh, you enjoy that Muslim dick, don't you? You think this is really fun to do? It's not fun at all. It's not fun at all to be defending a woman's honor. If a woman comes out and she says, I have been assaulted, I have been raped, who the fuck are you to say that she hasn't been? Because you read something on some website. Just you wait until you meet women who have been raped. And then you come back here and you tell me, I need proof, sweetheart. Every single woman I know has been sexually assaulted or raped. And I think that it is a really big disservice for men like you to go on air and say, look, I don't believe them. The fuck are we supposed to do with that?
Men in my life have had their lives destroyed by women accusing them of things they did not do. Thus, I have a different perspective of this. There were many cases where women I have seen in the media and I have seen play out on live, for instance, the UVM case, where women have accused men.
Were you affected by this case?
Huh?
Were you affected by this case?
I was not affected by that.
Okay, but could you imagine being affected by it? Could you imagine that every woman that you know has been raped? Your mother, your grandmother?
No, I could not.
No?
No.
It's really fucking hard.
I believe that.
It's really hard talking to grandmothers about what happened to them when they were 13 years old. It's really hard when you're dealing with little children who've been molested.
Yes, I believe that.
And you know what? I could give a shit if you think your reputation is ruined. If I have to deal with a woman who, with 5, has a penis stuffed into her. I mean, this is absolutely not an okay way of thinking. To think, oh, the man's reputation is so much more important than the fact that this woman has been violated.
He goes to jail and gets raped in jail. What is that? That's not just ruining a reputation. You're ruining, you're destroying a life.
Is that reality? Or is that something you read online?
That is reality.
That's something you read online? Or is that a reality? Like, you know this person?
I know at least 3 men in my personal circle that have had their lives destroyed.
Who have been
not
raped
from
in jail.
not from fake rape threats. In this case, most of those were actually divorce laws.
Oh,
But,
we won't talk about divorce laws.
Okay.
Oh, women can really ruin men's lives by divorcing them. What the fuck?
The topic I was trying to talk about was free speech and political correctness. Yeah, this alt-right movement. I don't know how we got there.
Because he said that Donald Trump he doesn't believe Donald Trump is sexist.
Yes.
Donald Trump. Yeah. So now let's talk about maybe Steve Bannon, Breitbart.
I don't care about Breitbart. I really don't. I think they're a trash site like the rest.
But Steve Bannon is part of the administration now.
Yes, and he himself, like Breitbart and like some other places, sometimes has good ideas, sometimes has bad ideas. It's not really... The thing is about the alt-right that it's... Okay, what Steve Bannon tried to do was try to say, oh, Breitbart is like the hub or the center of the alt-right. It never was because the alt-right never had a leader. because it was actually kind of a weird coalition. It's a thing I actually have asked myself in the past, how the hell did these people get together? Because you get very liberal people, like for instance Dave Rubin, whom I would recommend to anyone, who is a San Francisco based married homosexual man who does a interview show on YouTube. It's very good, talks to pretty much people from all over the political spectrum. And he reinvented the term classical liberal just to say, well, I'm not libertarian, I'm not Republican, I don't really agree with these people on everything, so I have to make an entirely new term for myself. And then you get people, libertarians like I would class myself, and then you get people who are actually, like Richard Spencer, who are actually fascist in some sense. And those are a very small minority of the entire thing, but they, for some reason, still are part of it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the, well, yes, with the political correctness debate that has been going on, that on many US campuses, and maybe that's just some website I'm looking at, maybe it's not really happening, although there's video evidence of it, but there is a large reduction in free speech, or sometimes even you are forbidden to speak freely, something that happened to Dr. Christina Hoff Sommers, okay, who calls herself still a feminist, but who says that some of the more modern versions of that with 63 different genders, it feels like, is maybe a bit too much, or maybe sometimes people fail to see both sides of a coin. And she basically, well, she does get the same threats, I imagine, that you said you do. And she gets attacked during her speeches by people who consider themselves very left-leaning, who I would class as left authoritarians. She gets shut down on campuses for just saying or just talking about some of the things she talks about. And I think that's a very big problem, and people have been thinking that for a longer time now. And I think the alt-right is just it just added up at some point. It's just a bunch of movements that just basically came together and said there's a certain amount of grievances here about free speech and freedom of expression that we can all agree on, and that basically around this we will form a coalition. And after that started up, Donald Trump came in as a candidate and was then at some point chosen somewhat as the bannerman, even though he sometimes says very stupid things, because he is willing to talk about things that no one else is willing to talk about. For instance, immigration, which has been a big topic in voters' minds, if you trust opinion polls. Since the 60s, pretty much, people have been wanting to talk about immigration and the problems that poses for a long time. They weren't able to because no one else was willing to talk about it. Now Trump came and started talking about it. Whether the manner in which he did was positive or negative is aside from the fact that he does talk about it. And that opened up a conversation that people want to have for a long time, that is very important to the country to this day. And whether or not you are pro-immigration or not, it doesn't really matter at this point. It's just, can we talk about it, please? That's kind of the thing. And at that, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, I don't have anything to say about the neo-Nazi movement.
Okay, that's a statement as well. Okay, so now I interrupted you.
No, that's fine.
Sorry. Okay, so my last topic for today would be radical Islam. That goes into the same direction. Maybe Donald Trump was the first first person who wanted to be president, which coined this term, or not coined this term, which brought it to a broader audience. Would you say it's as well a scapegoat, or is it a real threat, terrorism coming from Islamic countries?
Do you have anything you want to say?
I think you should start. I've been talking for quite a while now. I think you should get a word in.
I think if you go back to your question about freedom of speech and political correctness, I think we have to be really careful about the rhetoric that's being used. And by rhetoric, I don't mean if you disagree with me, then it's rhetoric. I mean rhetoric in the sense of our choice of words. And I think that there's a very intentional choice of words being used when we're talking about radical Islam. I think that we need to ask ourselves about radical Christianity, which exists in the US and influences our US government, our politicians especially. I think that is a huge problem if we're talking about radicalism, that religion has been brought into the government.
I actually somewhat agree with that, because I think radical religion in any sense is a problem. The reason I'm not a Christian anymore is because I actually visited a church my grandfather attends, and the pastor was, let's say, wacky, somewhat. And I decided on that day that I probably should I consider myself religious before that, but I saw the people there and was like, nah, I'm really not part of this club anymore. And within Western societies and within the US especially, I feel like, or from what I have seen, I'm not sure if this is entirely 100% true, but from what I've seen, people are tending to be more secular, more atheist. I think the what are they called? The evangelicals. Yeah, they're losing steam, or they're losing power. And Trump, I think, is one more expression of that, where the evangelicals, I think this might be the last election, let's put it that way, where the evangelical Christians actually had a real influence on politics. I think in the coming years, or I hope at least in the coming years, that their influence will be greatly diminished or not there at all anymore.
But his cabinet is evangelicals. Betsy DeVos is. Yeah, most of the people that he's put into his cabinet come from a group of evangelical Christians that would like to see their will put through in the U.S. And that's part of her thing with Betsy DeVos restructuring the education system, is to allow for privatization of the education system so that kids can go to church school, so that they can get their Christianity through the education system, which is troubling at the very least. And to think that they are on the decline is actually to misunderstand where the money that's funding his government is coming from. I also think that, just to interrupt for a second, I think that if we look back at Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, one of the things that she says is that the rise of totalitarianism will come because people are feeling isolated. And in that respect, these churches do provide community. I can absolutely see why people would want to be a part of that. But I also feel like it's a bit too late. Yeah, we're isolated as a community. We can't take that back. We can't change that. We can't sort of, we could maybe try to start new traditions and new rituals, but I think that the feelings that brought Trump to power are based in that isolationism. And I think that, if the church wants to play that role, then it has to also take some responsibility. And unfortunately, evangelical Christianity in the U.S. Sets up good versus evil. It's George W. Bush, us versus them again. And I think that is really, truly problematic. And then that comes out in a statement by Mr. Trump about radical Islam. You're saying that Islam, you're associating immediately this one religion with radicalism, when in fact, not all Islam is radical. But how many Muslims do people in the U.S. know in order to make that clear to themselves? And we see this. People are lighting just whatever mosque they want to on fire. They're executing Sikhs, even though Sikhs are not Islamic. It's this fear of the foreign. It's, I'm feeling isolated. I don't feel connected to people anymore. I don't have contact to these other people. And I think this rhetoric that he's choosing is just supporting that violence and supporting this really dangerous ideology. And I think that the internet and all these websites that we can read makes us feel more connected, but it actually, in many senses, isolates us even more, because we then go into our filter bubble and these traditions are missing, and all the rituals that we have that Hannah Arendt talks about. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I do think that they are filling a hole that exists, and it's just unfortunate that there doesn't seem to be another way or place to fill that hole. Yeah.
you weren't interrupting anything. Was anyway. That's interesting because on some of the things, again, I agree. I've been thinking a lot about lately the fact that the very same thing, that people feel more isolated. The falling away of religion, maybe in parts of the US only, maybe not in all parts, but at least in Europe and the people I see around me every day, none of them are religious. All of my close friends are pretty much atheists.
No, it's not comparable. It's not comparable to compare what's going on with secular Christianity in Germany, where people will register themselves as Catholic or Protestant, but then not attend church, when in the US it's actually the complete opposite. People are becoming more radical in their beliefs, and they are attending church more frequently.
In all of the US?
Mm-hmm.
That was, okay, that was not the impression I got from my visits, but okay, that's interesting. I should look that up, I guess. The impressions I had, though, was that religion was going back there. If it's not, then that's an interesting development, I guess. The thing is that you need the sense of community, yes, and the us versus them is something that leads you very fast into a totalitarian system. And I think one thing that what you have called the fascist movement, the alt-right, people who are very much on the individual freedom.
I didn't call it fascist.
You said you didn't want to talk about the fascist movement.
No, I said neo-Nazi.
Neo-Nazi, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just need to make that clear.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
The neo-Nazi movement. One thing that many people within that, or who would loosely consider themselves affiliated with that, we're talking about is that there is, on those people we see as our opponents, the corporate media and the basically authoritarian left-leaning people, or right-leaning people in the end, it doesn't really matter, that are what became to be called the establishment in the end, or what is the establishment, or the law basically in universities and so forth, that these people, they set up the us versus them very strongly too. They have, we're the good guys, you're the bad guys, we're the good guys, you're the racists, we're the good guys, you're the sexists, we're the good guys, and you have this, and people, I mean, obviously I don't consider myself a sexist or a racist, and so if I get called a sexist or a racist, I will react negatively to that. I will not take that, I would take that personally, because I think these things are bad, and thus if I get called a bad person, I will not like that. Now, therein comes the whole thing with, well, then I want you to prove that I am a sexist or a racist if you're going to call me that. And then you get into the point where sometimes, or most of the times, I don't think their arguments are very good or sufficient at all to call someone a sexist or a racist.
But it's not about name calling. I mean, I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the rhetoric, the choice of words that we have. And I think in the US, for example, you have this dialogue where people aren't having a conversation. Maybe that goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning about, your family can't talk to each other. But when people use the word feminist, for example, as a curse, like, oh my God, you're such a feminist. What? And it's the same with left and right. Yeah, you're so left, you're so liberal. These words have meanings, but they have lost their meaning because they're being used to curse somebody out, or you're taking it maybe and saying like, I'm a libertarian, this is a bad thing or something like that. But that's your own, feeling. And having these conversations, I don't feel is really very very useful to be like, oh, I think you're such a sexist, or I think you're such a misogynist. However, you can say that there are beliefs, and those beliefs are grounded in sexism. I think that there are beliefs that are grounded in racism, and if you have those beliefs, then all you need to be called out for them. You know what I mean? Like, you might not see yourself as being sexist, but if you're supporting somebody who says it's totally cool to rape a girl, then that's saying I devalue women, and in that respect, then you become a sexist. And I'm not saying this to go back to our old conversation, but I'm saying this is an example of how maybe you didn't consider yourself a sexist, but this belief, signifies your sexism. And I don't think that it does anybody any good for me to like throw this at you and say like, oh my God, you're such a sexist, but to say, I'm challenging this belief that you have, and you have this belief, you've just admitted to having it. And I think that that's a real problem that exists in current dialogue in the US, is this feeling of like, oh God, you're such a liberal, oh God, you're such a feminist. Like this is like these aren't curse words. they are labels, but they're not curse words. And instead, you know, maybe you could come at me and say, like, why is it wrong for me to believe that women should be equal? Yeah, then we can have an argument, then we can have a discussion. I think that's maybe one of the problems of talking about Trump as well, is that there's all these words flying around and people feel like they have to in some way hold on to their beliefs really closely. You know,
I think there's also a big problem that when people talk about a topic and they say a word like, for instance, feminism, it means something completely different to both sides of the aisle. But not just means something different, but I think at this point people literally have different definitions of commonly used words. And I think that goes back to the people actually living in somewhat separate worlds these days, because their information is completely different. I basically get my information from news sources I trust, like most people get their information from news sources they trust. And you would be saying that's just some website. Well, my generation, the generations after me, are raised with their news online, not with the news in the corporate media.
Right, but when I teach at university, I teach critical thinking, which is we need to go back and look at this website, who's writing it, what's their agenda, where are they getting their money from, also what sort of stance have they taken in the past, and there's all sorts of other information available on media literacy websites to say, like, this one tends to lean right, or it's funded by such and such a corporation. That stuff is all really public, open knowledge, and you can also make choices of your own to say, I appreciate this media site, or I don't. I think that that this discussion, which we've kind of gotten off track, but if we bring it back to the idea of Trump, there is discussion about, like, is the media doing him a good thing or disservice or a good thing or whatever? Like let's completely leave that out of it, and let's say, like, I'm basing my experience, my opinions on my experiences, and you're basing it on something that you've read, and that doesn't mean that it's not legitimate. Like, I'm not saying that in any way, but we have to have a conversation in which it's clear the people that we're talking about that are affected by Trump's policies are not just random things. These are real people with real issues and real problems. And I think that when we get to that point, then we can have a really good dialogue about him and his policies. And I think that it's the same for you. If you go back to the US and you see how your grandmother is impacted by healthcare, then the healthcare discussion has a different meaning. And I think that sort of is what's missing from the dialogue in Germany. It's missing a lot from dialogue that's happening in the US. There's talking heads on TV telling you how to feel, but are you talking to your neighbor about how this is going to affect them? Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's something that's really missing from the conversation, and that if we come out of that isolation, have conversations with each other without screaming, without, sorry, I screamed before, but, without using these words as derogatory or as, when he asked me to come here and he said, I want you to talk about Trump, I just kept thinking, like, I don't really have opinions about this man. I wouldn't have voted for him, I didn't vote for him, but he is a symbol of something else that's going on in the US. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed. Where are we at as a society? And that's something that, hopefully his presence will make people do it. And you see that with the Women's March. Women were totally like, whatever, we don't care about it. But suddenly they're all there to say, look, at least we've got this one thing in common. And they didn't get along. There were groups of people who were upset with each other. But they could say, at least we've got this one thing in common. We can come and have a conversation about where do we see the future for women in the society, which wasn't something that we had been doing before. So at least we have that hope that his presence, is going to be that thing that helps to bring us together. That's my hope.
Das war unsere brisante und vielleicht auch am Ende ein wenig versöhnliche Debatte über Donald Trump, seine Präsidentschaft, seine Politik mit Courtney und Bernie. Ich danke euch, dass ihr da wart. Es war sehr interessant, es war sehr schön, euch zu hören. Ich hoffe, es hat euch gefallen. Bis zum nächsten Mal bei Kaiser TV. Macht's gut!